Hi, welcome to Mood Food with Melissa. I'm Melissa, and today we're going to be making one of my favorite dessert recipes. We're going to be making my triple fudge brownies. And these can be done as like a traditional brownie in a tray, but I'm a huge fan of the edges, so we're going to be doing them as a brownie bite today and using some cupcake pans to make that really easy on ourselves. The recipe itself is very simple too. We're just going to start by combining our wet ingredients. And this is a one bowl recipe, so you won't even need to mix them separately than your dry ingredients. So we're gonna start with 2 eggs, which I've already cracked, and they're whole eggs, yolks and whites included. Then we're going to add about 3/4 of a cup of maple syrup. And we're going to combine the ingredients as we go. So now that I have those in there, I'm gonna whisk this gently and just get those eggs a little bit worked into there. The next thing that we'll add is about a cup, it's just over a cup of melted coconut oil. I love making this recipe so much. It's one of those recipes that I tend not to make at home too often because it's just so hard not to eat the whole batch. But definitely around the holidays or when I'm going to parties, it's such a fun thing to bring. So I'll add in vanilla, and this is about a tablespoon of vanilla extract. Just work that in there. And then we have a 1/2 cup of coconut sugar. And even though we added in some sweetener already with that maple syrup, we're adding in the coconut sugar as well because that helps just give a little more stability to our brownie. The maple syrup gives us a beautiful, deep flavor. It also helps with the fudgy texture, but using all maple syrup can sometimes leave these brownies a little too moist and they tend to fall apart that way. So it's important to use both of those sweeteners in there. Worked that in, and now we have about 1.25 cups of almond flour here. Going to mix that in. And it is important to use almond flour versus almond meal. You're not going to get the smooth texture that we're looking for from an almond meal. Good, and then we have 1.25 cups of Dutch cocoa powder. And I like to use a Dutch cocoa because it's been processed with alkali, and that helps to reduce the bitterness, and it also helps to remove a little bit of the caffeine content. As much as I love pure cacao, I think that sometimes the caffeine content can be a little overstimulating for some people, for the nervous system, digestion-wise, so this just helps to cut back on that. We're definitely going to use some pure cacao in here as well, but this will just give a little bit of a sweeter chocolate flavor and cut back on some of that caffeine exposure. Get that all whisked in. Now you could also use a spoon or a spatula for this part. I like to use a whisk. I think that it helps to kind of incorporate things, but obviously I'm being a little messy with my whisking here, so it's not necessarily the best tool to use, but I do think that it helps to just incorporate things a little bit easier, even if there is a little bit of the powder effect that comes with it. So we're getting that all worked in, and that's looking like some beautiful brownie batter. We're also going to work in here about a teaspoon of that beautiful Saltery One sea salt that I like to use. We're also going to finish this dish or this recipe with a little bit of sea salt as well, but you get very different flavors from salt being cooked into something versus finishing with the salt. So we're just gonna use a little bit in the recipe and we'll use a little more at the end. So this looks great. And then the last thing we're going to add in here are, these are some Hue brand chocolate, they call them Hue Hunks, and they're a high cacao content and they're very clean. They're made with just coconut oil, there's no binders. These are my favorite product to use. There's also sometimes, depending on where you're shopping, you can sometimes find a pure cacao chip, and that's my preference for this recipe, but if you can't find that, just find the highest cacao content chip, or you could use a bar and chop it up. I used the hunks and I just chopped them up here. You can chop them in a bag. You can chop them on a cutting board with a knife, or sometimes it's easier to just put them in a bag and just smash them and get them down to these little pieces. So I'm gonna add those in, and that's about 1/2 cup. And the reason you wanna make sure that you're using a high cacao content is because it's not going to add a ton of sweetness, but you will get those beautiful pops of just chocolate in with the fudgy brownie. So that is good to go. We don't want to over mix here. So that's our brownie batter, and we're going to go ahead and get this into the pans, and then we'll pop them into the oven. So our batter is all ready to go, and I have our cupcake pan set up here. I've just sprayed them very well with some high heat oil. I like to use an avocado oil spray. It just allows for the heat exposure without any additional browning, and you're definitely going to want to be able to get these easily out of the pans. You could use liners, but I think you don't get the same crispiness that way. So I like to do them straight in the pan and just make sure that I've sprayed the cupcake tins very well. And I'm just going to start by scooping the batter into these pans evenly, and then we're going to get them into the oven. This recipe is a great recipe if you are going to be bringing a dessert to an event and you want to share something that you know you'll enjoy, but you also want other people at the event to enjoy it as well. I bring these to almost every event around the holidays, or anytime somebody asks me to bring something sweet, this is my go-to. Most people that don't eat healthy still really enjoy this recipe. You can see here that I'm filling up the tins just about halfway, and that's gonna help keep them extra crispy and prevent any overflow while they're baking. So we've got our brownies into the pans. Like I mentioned, we want them about halfway full, and then we're gonna pop these into the oven at 350 degrees for about 15 minutes. And of course, every oven is going to be a little bit different, so just give them a check at about 15 minutes, and they might have to go in for a few more minutes. And of course, it's up to your level of preference. So if you want them extra crispy, go ahead and leave them in a little longer. Or if you want them to be falling apart, still a little gooey in the middle, you can just go ahead with that 15-minute check. So we're gonna pop these in the oven and wait for them to get finished. Okay, so our brownies are fresh out of the oven here, and they're still nice and warm. This batch took about 20 minutes in this oven, so just remember, check after that 15 minutes. I like to use a toothpick and just pop it down the middle, and then when you see it come out clean, that's how you'll know they'll be finished. I'm going to use this spoon just to kind of pat these down a tiny bit so I can get a nice flat surface for these hoo chunks that I'm going to add on top. And this is important to do this step while the brownies are still nice and warm and in their pan, because we're going to use the residual heat from the brownies to melt this chocolate. And that's gonna happen really easily because, as I mentioned earlier, who doesn't put any kind of weird binders or fillers into their chocolate, so it melts very easily. So we're gonna start by adding, I'm gonna do 2 each on these ones. So I'm gonna do 2 little hunks right in the middle there. And who also makes, they make a few different types of baking chips. They also make one with dates that is a little bit of a sweeter, more traditional chocolate chip. You could use those on top if you wanted more of like a milk chocolate kind of situation, but I love dark chocolate, especially with sea salt. So we're gonna do just these 2 on each one, and you can see that they're already starting to melt. So we don't need to do anything to hurry that along. We're just gonna wait for these to melt probably about 3/4 of the way. And then we're going to use the same spoon to just kind of smear those around on top, spread that chocolate out nice and evenly, and then we'll give them a little bit of time to rest and we'll take them out. But I'll walk you through all of that when we get there. So our chocolate looks pretty much melted enough, and so we're just gonna start using our spoon to kind of spread that chocolate around on top. Get a nice even layer there. So you could use more than 2 chips if you wanted to. You could use as much chocolate as you'd like, really, but for the purpose I'm using it for here, it's really just to give the sea salt something to stick to. So you don't need a huge layer of chocolate, but I think you can't go wrong with more chocolate on top of anything. So go ahead and add a few more chips if you'd like to, but don't be concerned if you're not getting like a frosting situation on top of these. You're really just looking for a little coating of that nice melted chocolate so our sea salt has something to stick to. And you might notice that some of the chips they still look whole, but because there are no binders in this chocolate, as I mentioned, it really just melts very easily. As soon as you put the pressure on them, those chunks will just melt right into a nice spreadable texture. So we've got our chocolate spread nice and evenly there, and we're just going to use a little bit of sea salt I always like to use that saltery sea salt that I mention all the time because of its mineral profile. You could use a traditional, just like a flaky sea salt on this, but you're going to get a lot of salt, and you're not going to get that same mineral composition that's going to help bloom the other flavors like the vanilla and the cocoa in there. So I highly recommend using this salt, but you can use whatever you have on hand. I'm just gonna do a little pinch there, and you'll see that it starts to sort of melt into the chocolate. That's perfectly okay, but you do wanna give it enough that it has a little bit of texture on top still. If the salt goes, and again, if you're using a finer salt, it's pretty much going to disappear completely, so don't keep adding salt till you can see it if you're doing that. But with this salt, you do wanna see a little bit of texture. So if you're adding just enough that it's disappearing into your chocolate, go ahead and add just a teeny bit more. These look so good. And I can already see that the chocolate is starting to harden, which is perfect. It's not going to get completely hardened, but it is going to kind of come out of this like molten state that we have it in now. So we're just gonna give these a couple more minutes to chill in the pan, and then we're gonna transfer them out and we can enjoy them. Okay, so our brownies have cooled a little bit and they're ready to come out of the pan now. I'm gonna use these little tea tongs to remove my brownies, but you can use kind of anything that has a thin, flat surface that will allow you to easily break the edge of the brownie off of the pan without really crumbling the brownie too much. So you can just, oh, these are lifting out perfectly. That is essential to using that cooking spray to get that easy lift there. So we'll go ahead and just get each one of these out of the pan. As you can see, I'm just kind of sticking the flat edge under one side of the brownie and then just gently lifting it up. There we go. These look so good. You can see the difference in color between the raw cacao and the Dutch cocoa that we used. You can see that the cacao chips that we put on top have a little more of that brown chocolate, and these have a dark, almost black chocolate look to them in the brownie. So they'll taste different, but they're both going to have that delicious chocolate flavor. And the texture of these brownies came out perfect. We're getting a nice, beautiful crust on the outside, and I can tell that they're gonna be nice and soft and chewy in the middle, especially right now while they're still nice and warm from the oven. All right, so there we go. That's our brownies right there. And these are ready to enjoy just as they are right now. They're phenomenal on their own, but one of my favorite ways to serve them is topped with the clean tahini caramel that I showed you guys in a previous episode. So if I'm going to serve them that way, what I do is I just take the caramel, and when you make the caramel, it starts out as kind of a loose caramel sauce texture, but by putting it in the refrigerator, it helps to firm it up into a little bit more of a sticky caramel that we can use as a topping. So I'm just gonna get a nice big spoonful here, and I'm gonna take that, top one of my brownies with it. And you can see I'm just kind of scooping it on here, and then I'm gonna use the back of my spoon to give it a little swirl. And the chocolate is still a little bit melted here, so it is mixing in with the caramel, but I think that makes it even better. So that's what I would do to top it with the caramel, and I'd also finish it with just a little more sea salt. Yum, so those look so good. And you can find the recipe for these triple fudge brownies on the website at moodfoodwithmelissa.com, along with the clean tahini caramel recipe that is covered in a previous episode. And I am going to be enjoying this brownie, and I can't wait to cook with you guys again next time. Thank you.